Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Neo-defense tech firms promise innovation, deterrence, and reindustrialization. But their real profit model may hinge less on hardware and more on locking in software. Here to sift through the hype and get to what it all means for the future of the U.S. defense strategy is defense analyst and War on the Rocks contributor, Jonathan Panter. Jonathan, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on.
You have written a recent article in War on the Rocks that describes a growing consensus around the promise of neo-defense tech. I want to begin by asking you to define that for me.
Yes, neo-defense tech generally refers to a host of modern upstart defense companies that have come about since about the early 2000s, but particularly since 2018 or so, that are promising a whole host of innovations intended to make the U.S. more competitive on the battlefields of the future.
And so what forces are driving the hype around these kinds of companies?
Well, there are two. The first force is a very genuine need, a very genuine recognition that China has outpaced the United States, both in its capacity, in the depth of its ability to manufacture defense products, and also increasingly in the sophistication of its weaponry. And so the first impetus behind the hype or behind the new defense upstarts is a very genuine need. And the second is the profit motive. What
is the narrative around these? How do you pull those two together?
The narrative is that the U.S. has been left behind, that the U.S. was excessively focused on land wars in the Middle East between the years 2000 and let's say about 2015 or 2016, that it lost sight of great power competition, and that it expended a great deal of resources and readiness on those wars in the Middle East. And all the while, China was getting ready for a potential contingency over Taiwan. And furthermore, what adds urgency to this narrative is the notion that the war between Russia and Ukraine has indicated the obsolescence of a number of the very powerful, sophisticated platforms upon which the U.S. military has relied for the past 30 years or more.
Behind some of that is the idea that more and cheaper is a better solution.
Yes. So the primary insight of the neo-defense tech companies, which, by the way, is a very valid one. My article was not necessarily critiquing entirely their argument, but the primary insight is that the U.S. has over-relied on very large, what they call exquisite and extremely expensive platforms, such as aircraft carriers, multi-mission combatant warships, the F-35, helicopters, and so on. And this excessive reliance makes the U.S. vulnerable to very small, cheap platforms that can disrupt, degrade, or destroy those, such as anti-ship missiles or small drones or AI-enabled weapons or swarm warfare.
And this seems to be aligned with what we hear from the Defense Department these days. You have an interesting argument in your article that might not be the best approach and that there's a reason we have big five prime contractors in the defense space. Talk us through that.
Yes, well, there remains very much an emerging debate. There are absolutists who claim that we should retire things like aircraft carriers and the F-35 and stealth bombers and manned aircraft entirely and so on, and that the future is all going to be AI-enabled swarms, edge computing, distributed forces, and so on. In other words, we should meet fire with what China is developing or with what Ukraine has demonstrated on the battlefield. That should be more or less the entire future of the U.S. armed forces force architecture. I don't see that coming, that argument being made in the DoD or the Department of War today per se. But certainly that is an argument that, if not latent, is often even explicitly stated by the neo-defense tech companies that are selling these products. And of course, it is very much in their interest to be absolutist about this. And on the other side of the argument, there are very few people who say that we should have no drones and we should have no AI and we should have no innovation. But there are people who argue for a more balanced approach that is sometimes called the high-low mix, that states that, well, certainly the U.S. is going to need to be ready to counteract the asymmetric capabilities brought by its adversaries. But by the same token, there is no replacement for some of the long-range exquisite capabilities that the U.S. has when it's fighting over long distances. And in the article, I made clear that I was on the side of that high-low mix.
I'm speaking with Jonathan Panter. He's a defense researcher. So let's come back to that. You also make a pretty clear argument that you can't compare the war in Ukraine with what the U.S. might engage in the Indo-Pacific, as an example.
Yes, and this has been a consistent problem because the war in Ukraine has captured the minds of so many in the United States and across the Western world because it's been on the front pages of our newspapers for several years now. And so the neo-defense tech companies have been quick to light upon examples from that conflict and say essentially, see, this is the future of warfare playing out and America is behind. But when you actually peel back the layers of the onion on this, you find that part of Ukraine's ability to withstand the Russian onslaught rests very much on what the same quote unquote exquisite capabilities that the neo-defense tech companies are maligning. Things like powerful air defense systems or long-range missiles or the HIMARS. And so I think that the extent to which drones have, quote unquote, enabled a Ukrainian victory on the front there, or Ukrainian success or resistance rather, is often overstated by the same people who stand to financially benefit from it.
Well, speaking of financial benefits, many of these neo-defense firms are funded by venture capital. Do you see a structural risk to the United States of relying on venture capital funded companies for a critical portion of the defense infrastructure?
Yes, to some extent, because the risk-return model is different, and the VCs are going to be looking for outsized returns. And that leads to the second issue that I noted in the article, which is that ultimately to get those VC-style returns, one of two things will have to happen. Either there will have to be an acquisition by a larger company, in which case we're back to where we started, just a bunch of very large companies and not this sort of distributed capacity, large-scale manufacturing company across many different small companies that people rightfully want. Or there will need to be an IPO. And in order to justify an IPO, these companies will have to demonstrate not only significant existing revenue, but also the possibility for expanding future revenue. And the way to do this is not through selling their cheap hardware. It is through getting the end user, which is the U.S. government or the military, hooked on that cheap hardware and then selling them the software. And so the argument in the article is that the true hidden business model of a significant portion of neo-defense companies that claim to be selling hardware is actually a software as a service model.
That's a pretty important distinction, considering near-term costs versus long-term system costs. You also maybe puncture a hole in the balloon of patriotic investing when it comes to these companies. Tell me more about that.
Well, that was really the impetus for writing the article in the first place. I have no doubt that many individual people at these companies themselves are patriot, nor do I have a doubt that some of their products are hopefully going to be quite valuable to the United States military in the years to come. I just tend to be skeptical when somebody's selling me something that when they tell me that it's for my own benefit. And that's when I began asking questions.
If you were advising Congress or DOD today, thinking long-term about defense strategy and acquisitions, what guardrails or reforms would you recommend to ensure that defense innovation really serves the national security, maybe not just investor returns for venture capitalists?
Well, I would recommend that we retain robust oversight over and due diligence functions within the department over the would-be sellers. And so there's often an argument, which is again to the neo-defense tech companies' financial interest, that there's too much regulation and that slows down innovation. And certainly in some areas that may be true, but we do have very important offices within the department who are tasked with ensuring that the taxpayer gets the best bang for their buck and ensuring that there's actual operational use cases and validity and concepts of operation for the employment of the weapons and systems that we are purchasing. And so I would advise that we do not underfund those doing that due diligence.
I've been speaking with Jonathan Panter. He's a defense researcher. We'll post this interview and a link to his article at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.